let me say it the way the radio announcers would. No, I'm just kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, please welcome one of our featured authors to the GMAP Broadcast Network, Mr. Adair Sanders. Adair Sanders, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Pastor. I'm so pleased to be here, and I want to thank you again for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak with all the people who listen to your network. I'm glad to be a part of it today. For y'all who maybe didn't hear the interview I gave last Friday, the reason I'm talking today is I was asked to speak about a memoir that I wrote in, I think 2010 is actually when I wrote it. It's called Biologically Bankrupt. And the subtitle, which really tells you a lot about what the story is The Sins of the Father. And you will recall that in the Bible, there are many places where, particularly in the Old Testament, where the word talks about the sins of the fathers being carried on to the third and fourth generation. Exodus 34:7, Numbers 14:18, Deuteronomy 5, verses 9 and 10. So when I wrote this book, which is really the story of how our generational messaging comes down from father to son or daughter to grandchild, and how damaging that can be unless we can stop the hurtful, the painful messaging. So it just seemed appropriate to me that Biologically Bankrupt and then The Sins of the Father was the appropriate title for this book. I also, and have mentioned this last Friday, I felt very strongly that writing this book was a spiritual call. It was the only book I intended to write. I have written many more fiction books, but this is a true story that I felt compelled to write. And I can remember driving down a 2-lane road in Western North Carolina in a rural area and crying to the Lord that the only thing I could give was this story. And so I really do feel that I have to share it with other people. In my case, the family that I grew up in had a lot of abuse, both physical and emotional, mental abuse, some addiction, just some very unhealthy behavior. And so I had several people suggest to me that I tell the story. So I did write it, and today and then for 3 more Tuesdays, I will talk to y'all about the book and give you sort of an overview of a few of the chapters each Tuesday. I start the book with a prologue, and the reason I did that was I wanted to give the readers a little idea of who my father is or was. So I opened the book on the day that I buried him. And I'll talk a little bit about the cemetery that he's buried in, because it has an interesting significance to how he saw life. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and so did my father and mother. There still is a cemetery there called Forest Hills, and it's the big society cemetery. And my mother always wanted to be buried there. My father's family was buried in a cemetery called Greenwood Cemetery that was on the other side of town. And my father was just adamant that my mother would have to be buried over there with that family. So when my mother became very ill and he thought she was going to die, in order to look good, because that was the primary motivator in his life, in order to look good, he actually bought 2 plots in Forest Hills and was going to bury her there. She survived. He got sick and died and ended up in Forest Hills. The family said he probably had intended to bury her there so he would look good, like he was adhering to her last wishes, and then move her later. But, it didn't happen that way. My father was always right. And that had damaging effects on myself and my brother growing up. There was no arguing with him. He played the martyr role very well. He took care of his mother, who needed absolutely no taking care of. He took care of a friend of the family. He actually did everything for her, to the detriment of any kind of relationship with us, his children, and his wife, my mother. But burying him that day in April really enabled me to feel safe in writing this story, because what I did discover in the last days of his life, and I won't talk much about that today because it's more towards the end of the book, but I really was able to find some reconciliation there and understand why he was the person he was and why he treated his children and his wife the way he did. I'm not sure that he could have made another choice, but I do open the book. And you'll have to excuse me, I'm looking at my notes over here. I do open the book with the cemetery and the funeral because it seemed to be just the right place to start it. The chapters don't have numbers. They have names of places or events. So that's how I'll start these. It won't be chapter 1, 2, or 3, but I actually will read or talk to you today about 4 distinct, for lack of a better word, chapters in Biologically Bankrupt, starting with McKenzie Street. McKenzie Street is a street in East Chattanooga where I spent the first 7 years of my life. My father and mother married after dating for 30 days. My mother was a widow. Her husband actually had survived World War II, but had stayed in the military as a pilot. And then his plane had gone down just on a regular training mission over the western part of the United States. But she was a widow at 23 or 24. And she married my father in this whirlwind courtship. And when they married, they had many friends who lived in an apartment complex in Chattanooga. And my father promised my mother that they would get an apartment and live there with their friends. What my mother did not know was that there was a very sick and dysfunctional relationship between my father and his mother, my grandmother. So after they married, he moved my mother into an upstairs apartment in the house on McKenzie Street where my grandmother lived. And they stayed there until I was 7 years old. My mother had to have been miserable. My grandmother, who was a very demanding person, and we'll talk a little bit more about her today and on other Tuesdays. Every time the phone rang, she would pick up the phone to determine who my mother was going to talk to. Mother had to ask permission to use the phone. They had a party line. Probably all of y'all are too young to know what a party line is, but they had one because my father didn't want to waste money having a separate phone line. Every day when my father came home from work, he spent his first hour with his mother downstairs before he ever came up to see my mother or me or my brother after both of us were born. My father had a terrible, terrible temper, and it would come out at the most inopportune times. The memories I have of living at McKenzie Street, most of them are pretty nice. There was an orchard, and I remember, picking apples at the orchard. I remember being in the kitchen with my grandmother, and she would be cooking our apples to put away, to can and put away for the winter. But I also knew that I had to do everything my father said. So here is an example of the kind of anger that I grew up with and that my brother also grew up with. I was about 4 years old. We had gone to the vet, taken our dog to the vet, and there was a beautiful German Shepherd in there. And I asked the man, could I pet his dog? And he said, oh, yes, you may. So when I reached out to pet the dog, it bit me. Everyone was shocked. They put the dog to see if he had rabies, and we went home. Well, I knew I was in deep trouble. And sure enough, I was trying to hide behind the refrigerator in my grandmother's kitchen. And Daddy came home and he found out what had happened. And he came in and was just screaming and told me that if he had to pay for rabies shots for me, he was going to beat my A. And you know what that is. I mean, I was terrified, and I didn't doubt for a minute that that's exactly what would happen, because when he got angry, he hit me. I don't know if he ever hit my mother. The things he did to my mother were much worse than physical abuse. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. But my brother, here's an example. My brother actually was bitten by a chipmunk several years later. And he was so afraid to tell my dad that he had cornered this animal. And of course, the animal reached out and bit him in terror. He refused to tell that to my father, and actually took 14 rabies shots to avoid being whipped for being stupid. So, I mean, we all grew up in this situation that was like living with an alcoholic, even though my father was not an alcoholic with liquor. He was a rageaholic with his anger. And so from a very young age, I learned that whatever he said, you didn't argue with him. You just went along with it. It was just very, very difficult. The other thing I remember about living at McKenzie Street is that I wasn't allowed to play with any of the children in the neighborhood. My father had a very inflated idea of his self-worth and who he was. And the house that my grandmother had that he had lived in was a big old white house up on a hill. So for some reason, he thought that gave him some specific, to lord it over other people. He also had been allowed to go to a private school the last 4 years of his high school because my grandmother was a teacher and got a discount. But all of that just inflated his ego, and I was not allowed to play with any of the neighborhood children. I found out years later that the one child that I really wanted to play with, I wasn't allowed to play with her because her daddy worked a shift at night. And so they were blue collar workers, and they weren't good enough in the eyes of my father. So even though we didn't have anything particular, my grandmother was a school teacher. My grandfather he died before I knew him, but when he was alive, he was a plant manager. And my mother had been a secretary when she married Daddy. I mean, we didn't have any big deal, but it was that we're better than other people and you can't have anything to do with them. So at a very young age, I started being indoctrinated on this them versus us mentality. I just don't remember really my father having much of anything good to say about other people. He was always very critical about them. The next chapter is called Little Dickie, and that is the name that my grandmother gave my daddy, whose name was Richard. She called him Little Dickie his entire life, and she called him that in front of other people, which had to be demeaning to him. She refused to let him play sports. He had to be home and sit at the kitchen table to do his homework. She made him take dance lessons, and there's all these old pictures of him in these dancing costumes. You know, he was a petulant and unhappy young man. He grew up in a terribly dysfunctional family. His father, he was an only child. His father, my grandfather, who I never knew, was an extraordinarily handsome man. About 6'4", mustache, slim, good looking. I've seen pictures of him standing next to a speedboat, next to a nice car. My grandmother, on the other hand, was a very plain, overweight woman. You would never have put the two of them together. It was a marriage of financial interest because my grandfather's, let's see if I can get this right. My grandfather's father had married my grandmother's mother after both their spouses died. And my grandfather didn't want the money to go out of the family, what there was, which wasn't like, there was a lot there, but he didn't want any of it to get away. So after he married my grandmother, they entered into some type of devilish arrangement where basically my father was given over to the care of his mother, my grandmother, to raise him however she wanted. And my grandfather went off and lived with a bunch of mistresses. I can remember my mother telling me on the streets of Chattanooga that one of her cousins had pointed out this woman who then in her 70s, had been a mistress of my grandfather. So my father grew up in a horribly dysfunctional family situation. And in his mind, by the time he married my mother, women were either whores or they were Madonnas, and there was nobody in between. And I think he was really conflicted when he married my mother. I think he loved my mother, but my mother was a widow, and in his mind, she was damaged goods. So there was always this unhealthy sexual overtone in their marriage and in the family dynamic and in just things that he would say. He just was never, my father was never happy. He hated everybody. He hated gay people. He hated black people. He hated Spanish people. And I don't really know who he liked. The ironic thing was he put his philandering father up on a pedestal so that by the time he was telling stories to me and to my brother, our grandfather, who we never knew, had been like this wonderful person, when in fact he had had a pretty sordid and inappropriate marriage and life with my grandmother. But all of that is part of what shaped my father. The next chapter is called The Johnson Women, and it talks about my mother, because this story, to understand how messaging is carried across generations, and the reason I wrote the book, you have to understand where my father came from and where my mother came from, and the messages both of them got from their own parents. So the chapter of The Johnson Women talks about my mother and her upbringing. My mother had, 4 sisters and a brother. The oldest child died of diphtheria before my mother was born, back in the early 20s, or I guess around the turn of the century, because my mother was born in 25. Diphtheria killed people. So it ended up that it was my mother, Aunt Janice, and Uncle Charlie, and who really kind of grew up together because Mary Charles had died. She was the eldest and she had died. Years later, when my mother was an adult, my grandmother, Ruth, had 2 other children. She had Carol, and then 7 years after Carol, she had Peggy. My mother had married and had been in her first marriage and then became a widow, and then she had married my dad and was not living at home, obviously. Aunt Janice had married and she was not at home. And Uncle Charlie had been basically kicked out of the family, and we'll talk about that at some point too, because it also talks about just the sadness that can be carried generationally. So when Carol was 15 and Peggy was 8, their mother died. My grandmother Ruth was afraid of doctors. She had never gone to a doctor. She had a heart attack and wouldn't go to the hospital. So she died at home in front of those 2 young girls, one 15 and one 8. My mother and Aunt Janice had really a different relationship because they had both the father and the mother. My grandfather had doted on my mother and Aunt Janice. But after grandmother Ruth died, my grandfather just kind of fell apart. He just could not be a parent any longer. And neither my mother nor Aunt Janice would step in to help. I think part of it was by then my mother was in a really bad situation with my dad. But Aunt Carol tells me the story that my mother would come over and run her finger over a piece of furniture and go, "Ooh, dust." So it seemed like there was an absence of affection, an absence of love. When my Aunt Charlotte got married, she married a Catholic man, and my mother and Aunt Janice just went crazy. This was this people aren't like us type of thing. It just very, very sad, very sad. So for whatever reason, my mother abandoned her other 2 sisters. She pretty much abandoned her brother. In fact, I was in high school, and my mother and I were together. We had gone into a drugstore, And there was this man sitting at the counter, and my mother knew him, and she stopped and spoke to him and did not introduce me, which was odd because that was sort of against Southern etiquette. You would normally introduce the people to each other. And when we left, I find out that's her brother, who had been basically expelled from the family because he had a drinking problem and nobody wanted to deal with him. It was the same kind of craziness. About the same time, we were driving past the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, and my mother says, "Oh, I need to tell you something." And she reveals her first marriage. I'm stunned. And I said, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And she said, "Because your father didn't want you to know." And again, I now know that's because he saw her as some type of damaged goods and was conflicted by it. So there were all these secrets that started being told in my family, in the family dynamic that I grew up in, but they were still the kind of secrets that my own parents had grown up with. So it was beginning to be taken over the generations. The next chapter and the last chapter that I'll talk briefly about today is called The Son. I had mentioned last Friday when I was interviewed on this channel that when I was born, my father, interestingly enough, he had just decided that there was no way that he would have a daughter. That it just wasn't going to happen. That he had proclaimed he was going to have a son, and of course, I was born first, and I'm not a boy, so there was no name for me, and I ended up getting my mother's middle name and my dad's middle name. Well, 4.5 years after I was born, my brother Dan was born, and my father was ecstatic because I now know and learned as an adult, saw what the dynamic that happened. He was going to live his life over through my brother, live the life that his mother had forbidden him to live. So when my brother was 3 or 4 years old, my father would make him sit in front of the television, the black and white television, and watch sports. And I can remember my brother crying because he didn't want to do that. He wanted to go outside and play with his friends or play with his trucks or whatever. But no, he had to sit in front of the TV. As my brother continued to grow, my father forced him into sports. Now, eventually it took. My brother became a gifted, and I mean a truly gifted athlete. But growing up, when he played the Little League football, my father was the coach because he wanted to make certain that it all revolved around my brother Dan. My father wouldn't let other children play, have much playing time if they couldn't make Dan look good or they couldn't help score. That's horrible to do that to young children, but that's just the way it was in our house. My entire growing up, it was always Dan. We would go to this sport. We would go to this sport. We would go to this sport. So Dan gets into high school. And by then, he really has taken all of my father's lines as the gospel. He's become arrogant. He's become egotistical. He believes he's better than everybody else. He was so rude to people that the high school he was in, he was not asked to be in any clubs because he was just so arrogant no one could stand to be around him. But he was a gifted athlete. He had offers from several small colleges to come and play football. But my father had said, no, you have to play for the SEC. That's the only, college you can go to. Well, gifted athlete or not, my brother was 5'10", and a 5'10" quarterback wasn't going to make it in big-time football. So he failed at that and was never, ever able to get beyond emotionally his glory days of high school. And as we will talk about going forward in subsequent Tuesdays, that inability to leave that behind and to mature and to look for another way to grow up really damaged my brother, damaged his life, damaged the choices he made. And my father, as we will see as this continues, continued to enable him to think that he was better than everybody else, that it wasn't his fault that he didn't get to play. I mean, he had actually had a retired admiral offer him an appointment to Annapolis, and he turned it down because Daddy told him he should play SEC ball. So you can see just by this little bit we've talked about today, that my father, he came from messaging where he was ignored by his own father. He really was emasculated by his mother. And so he shaped and defined him. And then when he met my mother, who was a vulnerable widow, it just was a marriage that never should have happened. My mother tried to leave him a couple of times. You just didn't do that in the 50s. And so they stayed together for over 50 years in a terribly dysfunctional marriage. The insecurities my father had about himself manifested terribly in my brother and myself, and in the bad choices we made as young adults. This is not all a terrible story. There's sadness in it, and there's certainly examples of bad choices. But if you'll continue to join me for the next 3 Tuesdays, I think you'll see that even when life gets really, really dark, and we've made some terrible choices and had terrible consequences, that there is redemption and there can be reconciliation at the end of the day. And that's about all I have to say today.